So for those who haven't been to one of our webinars before, my name is Teresa Hebert, and I lead communications at Quorum. And just a few housekeeping items. We will be recording this session and sharing out that recording and after the session. So if you have to jump early, if you show up a few minutes late, this will be available to you in your inbox in about 24 hours or so after we finish here today. And today we are here to discuss unifying your lobbying and advocacy efforts. So we've got folks probably who are here from the grassroots teams at their organizations, folks who represent the lobbying side of the house who want to learn how they can collaborate better with their colleagues and why that actually is impactful to the work that you all do. So let's dive in. So our agenda today, there we go. We're on a bit of a delay for my clicks here. Our agenda for today. First, we're going to dig into the why. Why do we bother working across advocacy and lobbying? What benefits does that play for your team? Because we know that sometimes bringing in extra folks can create more work, but we're going to talk through today why that actually is beneficial. Then we're going to walk through the different ways that you can do it by coordinating communications, sharing advocate stories, data, and intel, operating with conditional messaging, and using shared metrics to benefit both teams. First, want to dive for just a second a little bit about Quorum for those of you who are not yet using Quorum or are considering expanding your subscription or just not familiar with us. Quorum is public affairs software that helps you get information and execute strategy all in one place. So Quorum supports your stakeholder engagement, grassroots advocacy, legislative tracking, and PAC management all in one place. And this is really core to today because we're going to talk through some strategies that it's not just unifying your teams and maybe having collaborative meetings or collaborative strategy sessions, but there's actually additional benefit to having software that crosses both advocacy and lobbying ledge tracking and gives you some extra muscle beyond just kind of being in the same system and using the same layouts, but actually some extra functionality that exists when you bring those two together. So we'll dive into that a little bit, but also talk plenty of strategies that you can use even if you're not using a system like Quorum yet. So why is collaboration so critical? So I look at it like a Venn diagram. There's so many things that overlap between what lobbying and advocacy work on. And that's issue messaging, communicating to lawmakers, reporting on impact. Both of these sides of the equation, they're doing some kind of issue messaging. On the lobbying side, that's messaging in sophisticated language to detail issues and with detailed issue specifics. Whereas on the advocacy side, you might be messaging in more simple language to drive mass engagement from your advocacy network. From the lobbying side, you're communicating to lawmakers representing experts, representing the really in the weeds knowledge of how a bill works and what it will do. Advocacy is messaging to lawmakers with advocates, where they're sharing stories and more qualitative information. Lobbyists have KPIs like the number of meetings they have, the number of champions they build. Advocacy has KPIs like the number of messages they send, the number of advocates gained in their network. But these core functions, these three of how do you message your issue, how do you get across to lawmakers, how do you show your impact, that is really the same across both. And so there's ways that we can bring synergies of the two together to increase that impact. So let's dive straight into strategy number one of how these two teams can work together, and that is coordinating communications. Now, two different ways that we think about coordinating communications. The first one is aligning your message and sharing feedback. So both, when you're creating messaging, there's no need to reinvent the wheel every time. And so you can take the lessons learned across advocacy and lobbying to share best practices. On the advocacy side, you have the advantage of scale. You're sending lots of emails to your advocacy network. You probably have more than 500 advocates for a lot of organizations, which is the maximum that a lobbyist is really going to be able to email if you're working at the federal level. So advocacy professionals have that scale where they can get really good metrics of what subject lines are getting opens, what resources are driving clicks when you share them in an email. What themes are you seeing in advocate stories? And really take that scale and share it with the lobbying team. The lobbying team, on the other hand, has more direct feedback. They are talking face to face with lawmakers, and they can see how they react to messaging. They can see which parts people might be confused by when they discuss it in a meeting with a legislator. So you bring these two best practices together, and it's really going to make your messaging clearer for both groups. Operationally, how does this work? With a system like Quorum, we use a system called issue management for sharing those resources. You can think of issue management as a folder system for your policy portfolio, where each issue and sub-issue has its own place to store your notes, your advocate lists who are focused on that issue, your key champions, and make it really that central source of information. And so if the advocacy team has an email that performs really, really well at driving opens, they can share and attach notes of that in their issue. If the lobbying team has a hearing testimony that really drew a lot of engagement from lawmakers, they can share that as well and really create this central database of messaging that both teams can dig into. The part two of coordinating communications is aligning your timing. So when you're communicating to lawmakers, you don't want your advocacy team sending messages and then it goes crickets from the lobbying side, or vice versa. The lobbying team is meeting and then it's not followed up with those advocate messages. And so coordinating your communications really makes a stronger impact with those legislators because they're hearing from you from both sides. How do you actually do this? We have kind of a three-step process that we see a lot of organizations follow. First, you kickstart your advocacy campaign. You send those calls to action, you set up your action center or your advocacy website to collect advocate letters. But what you're going to do differently than maybe you are before is you're going to hold those letters for quote unquote approval. Basically collect them, but don't hit send yet. Then your lobbying team steps in. They're going to schedule their lobbying meetings across the Capitol Hill, across the given state legislature, whatever it may be. On the day of those meetings, you as the advocacy professional can quote unquote approve the letters, meaning that they hit the inbox of those officials in tandem with the day that you're meeting in person. We see folks do things like this for fly-ins where they want in-person advocate meetings at the same time as advocate letters, but it really does work well with the lobbyists with the lobbying meetings as well. So you're getting hit across emails. You could include emails and then meetings. You could also run a call campaign at the same day, but really bringing that cross-functional communication at once. I will call out that Quorum Grassroots has this feature built in for easy use. We have a easy flip the switch to hold those for approval and send them on the day that you choose. So this means that you can really have a louder impact. Even if it's not scheduled with in-person meetings, that approval functionality really has a lot of benefit, even if your grassroots campaign is going solo, because we've all seen the impact in our work of the difference between getting 100 emails in one day about a topic versus 1 or 2 every day. And so that approval holding of your letters can really have a lot of impact in getting your voice heard for those lawmakers. Our second means of unifying your lobbying and advocacy efforts is by collaborating on the use of advocate stories. We've all heard, we all know the impact of a story, and a lot of us talk about the Pixar method of how to get your point across through storytelling in a way that really resonates and makes it harder to forget. And so your advocate stories are the way to unlock that when you're trying to make change on an issue. So similar to the last slide where we talked about the advocacy team collecting their input and then sending it off to the lobbying team to then make use of, we're going to do something similar here. So first is the story collection process. Using your advocacy website, you can set up an intake form for, instead of send a letter, to share your story. We have folks who will use prompts or kind of Mad Lib structures to help make it easier for advocates to share their story. Stories don't have to be super long. They can, whatever you can collect that gives really a qualitative emphasis on the impacts of a policy issue. either the way that it benefits them now and the risk that would happen if it was changed, or the pain that an advocate experiences now and how it would be better by a new policy. After you have those stories collected, you want to pass them over to the lobbying team, and the lobbying team is going to use them in a few different ways. The first is pretty straightforward. Personalize complex issues. Put a face to this policy that you're talking about. Show that while the conversation between a lobbyist and a lawmaker might be really in the weeds, there is also this personal element to it. The second is actually as a resource for your legislative champions. When every organization has the legislators that they want to keep engaged because they really believe in their issue, but sometimes that makes it harder because you aren't asking them for things all the time. You don't need to run campaigns asking for their vote. They're always going to join with you. And so instead, you can be a resource to help them sway their colleagues. So we used to do a blog series called Behind the Desk, where we interviewed legislators about what was engaging to them. When they interacted with advocacy organizations, what worked. And we had a legislator speak to how when they received stories from organizations they aligned with, it actually gave them a resource to use when they were making floor statements or statements in committee hearings, that they wanted to use stories to their colleagues because they know the power of them. And so your organization can be one of the resources that provides those to folks. And then finally, the impact of naming the towns and cities and counties where advocates have shared stories. So besides putting the face to the issue, also connecting it back to the district also has a really big impact with those stories. So we have a similar quote from a legislator. When you hear from a familiar city or even a familiar name, that really helps resonate with the congressman or congresswoman. So again, makes those conversations and lobbying meetings stand out. Again, this is a built-in functionality of Quorum Grassroots. If you are using it, you can choose a campaign type to share your story rather than send a letter or make a call as an additional option. It's a great thing to send to your more engaged advocates who are already really excited about your issue, the ones who always participate in your letter writing campaigns, who want to do more. This is a great way to activate those folks. And something exciting that is coming in the future for Quorum Grassroots is the ability to do video stories for your advocates and bring that storytelling to a new, more powerful medium with video. So that's not existing yet, but coming soon. All right, next we're going to talk about the power of sharing advocate data across lobbying and advocacy. So we all know the power of data, and there's probably a lot of data that the lobbying folks on the call are really used to using. Economic impact of the organization in a given district, how many jobs you create, how much you contribute to the state economy or the district economy, all of those good things. Metrics on the impact of a bill, how many new jobs it could create or harm, how much it'll cost to a given organization, how much it will increase costs to advocates, all those kinds of things. And then basics like how many other sponsors are there that might help sway a legislator who wants to know that other people are backing this issue. Or if you're working at the state level, how many other states are considering similar bills? Those are probably things you're already used to using. But when the lobbying and advocacy teams collaborate, that advocate data can bring it to the next level. So things like the number of advocate contacts in a state or district, or the number of actions taken by contacts. So let's start with contacts in a state or district. Again, this is a counter to those stories by showing the volume. How many people in the district care and have taken the time to participate in speaking out on this issue. We know that lawmakers are motivated by votes and by winning their next election. And so giving a concrete number to how many people that have the power to vote for you in the next election have said that they care about this issue or that are represented by our organization. And then actions taken by contacts. We know that legislative offices might have some sort of system of weekly reports from their staff about the number of messages they're receiving, but the legislator themselves is probably not checking the emails or checking in on the phone calls that often. And so when you can remind them in person in your conversations, we emailed you 200 times last month, or we had 25 people take time out of their day to call, that can really help connect the dots for the legislator and make them aware of the efforts that your organization is putting in that maybe they weren't so closely tied to compared to their staff. This here is an image of a one-pager that you could use, generated with Quorum's Download Center, but lots of different systems that could make something like this, where you are bringing that data into a nice professional deliverable that you can leave behind after that meeting. Okay, after talking about advocate data, I want to talk about advocate intel. This is particularly relevant for organizations who are running fly-ins or lobby days, or have grasstops advocates that are meeting in person with the legislators on your organization's behalf. Something that we had a client report to us that is that legislators and staff are sometimes more forthcoming when they're speaking to an advocate than when they are speaking to a lobbyist. They might be more candid about the stories that they share, or more candid with their reactions to different information. And that can be really valuable to you on the lobbying side of the equation in like which parts to message towards, which information to focus in on in a given bill, based on what the advocate learned that you maybe wouldn't have been able to. So how to operationalize this? First is, of course, the advocate meetings. You might be having a fly-in or a lobby day. After that, you want to provide your advocates with some kind of system to report back what they learned in those meetings. Now, obviously, a lot of you will have staff in those meetings to also be listening, but it can be helpful to have advocates share their own takeaways as well. Then the lobbyist can read that information and have that immediate follow-up. You're probably doing follow-up from your fly-ins anyway, because you want to keep the momentum that you gained from those conversations and that all the effort that went into the fly-in. So your lobbyists are likely scheduling follow-up meetings either way, but now they can have a follow-up that's based on the exact conversations that were had in the fly-in, rather than kind of starting on their usual spiel, their usual talking points. They can personalize based on what the advocate conversation included. So an example of this that we had was with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Constituents get intel from staffers that they may not tell our on-staff lobbyists. So that's so important, because they can then come back to FCNL's lobbyists who are working on the issue, and they can use that in their strategy and in their coalitions to drive this change. In this particular case, they were working on the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and they had advocates who learned from the staff and legislators that we really like Part A of this bill, but we don't really like Part B. And that gives so much more information than just the person is a supporter or is in opposition to the bill. And with that, they could really personalize their follow-up. So if you're using Quorum, you have the external interaction logger available on the go for your advocates, built into the system, but really there's many different ways you could collect that information if you're using more manual systems. But when you're using a system like Quorum, your lobbyist can quickly go to the profile of that official and see all those notes in one place, and all that information side by side. So our next best practice with unifying your lobbying and advocacy teams is conditional messaging. So something I want to preface here is this is really a software-driven benefit, where it might not involve talking specifically to the lobbyists, but it's the benefit of having a system where your legislative tracking data and your grassroots advocacy data speak in the same system. So what this display is here is what you might refer to as a thank and shame campaign, where you have different messages based on the way that the legislator has responded to that issue so far, where you want to thank the legislators that have sponsored the way that your organization aligns with, and quote unquote shame the legislator who has not yet taken that action or has taken an opposite action. And what is important about this is that you don't get the messages mixed up. The kind of worst thing that you can do when running this kind of campaign is send that quote unquote shame message to a legislator who actually has already taken that action. Because then it shows like maybe you're not paying attention, or maybe like you don't actually care about me specifically and you're sending these out en masse. And so what happens when you have a system like Quorum Grassroots and Quorum Federal or state, where they are in the same system, you get that data automatically updated. So let's talk through how this works operationally. So you set up your advocacy campaign where whenever a advocate signs in and gives their address so you can match them to their official, it will populate the message based on the way that legislator has sponsored. But sponsors change every day. New folks sign on, and that list of folks who should be receiving the thank message grows. With Quorum, you don't have to touch anything, and it will automatically adjust those lists as new sponsors sign on. You don't have to come in and change the targets. You don't have to come in and change the messaging for a given district. We do that for you automatically on the back end. And so you can be sure that you are never ending up in that sticky situation of sending the wrong message to the wrong official. So that's a very basic way of using conditional messaging, but there are some more advanced ways. So Quorum recently introduced new functionality to our grassroots tools that allows you to create up to 6 different groups to receive personalized messaging. We all know that personalized messaging is most effective, but it can be difficult to scale, and that you might want to talk to a Democrat different than a Republican on a different issue because different things are resonant to them. Or the folks in the Northeast might respond to a bill differently than those in the Midwest, than those in the West. Or you might want to ask for sponsorship from members of the key committee, but you might want to focus on just educating on your issue for folks who don't yet have a say yet because it hasn't moved out of that process. And so with this new functionality, you can create up to 6 groups and write a unique message for each of those groups. So in this example, you might have one message that goes to House Democrats, one that goes to Senate Democrats, one to House Republicans on the Appropriations Committee, one to Senate Republicans in the Midwest, and one to all Republicans who are in leadership. You set this up at the start, you write each of those messages, and as your advocates fill out their address, the right message populates. So you can get that more targeted approach to communicating with officials. If you like, you can also take it one step further and bring in some AI to generate many variations of those messages. So not only is there one version of the Senate Democrats letter, you can create up to 50 so that it comes across a little bit less like a form letter and they're getting different variations of that message from you. So because the systems are integrated and we have that data to easily select different groups of by party, by region, by past behavior on given legislation, you can create groups in a way that other software that doesn't work together doesn't allow. And finally, the last means of unifying that I want to talk through before we jump into questions is reporting and metrics. So everyone who is on this call likely has some means of reporting up to their boss. And their boss probably reports up to that manager, and so on and so forth. And so this can be really powerful if your teams are operating in the same system and you don't have to bring separate spreadsheets, separate data all together into one place. It's already there. So what's here on the screen is a way that you can use that combined reporting and combined data to identify gaps and build better strategy. And so what we have here is we have taken and built some lists of a couple examples of ways you might want to do this. For example, down here in the middle, we've got lobby targets without grassroots cover. So what that might mean is that your lobbying team has identified their key champions for the year, the folks who hold the greatest sway, the folks who have sponsored bills, whatever criteria that means for you. You can create a filter so you can identify who are the legislators that the lobbying team has identified as important, but we haven't sent them any grassroots actions yet, or we don't have a grass tops advocate assigned to them. And this will be, again, an auto-updating filter so that as you continue to fill those gaps, that list changes. Another example might be legislators that have mentioned your issue, but you don't have a relationship yet. So you can track their social media dialogue, their press releases, and filter for those who you don't have an assigned staff member, and make sure to fill those gaps. Who has the PAC given to, but the lobbying team hasn't engaged yet? So they might be misaligned on who their key targets are. So there's a lot of ways that you can share information to identify where your teams are misaligned and where you need to get in that alignment using an integrated system like Quorum or like another integrated software. So this is one way, and this exact photo here is one of our dashboards, which can be shared with non-Quorum users if you'd like, can be shared up to your boss. And again, auto-updating so that you can always have up-to-date information on the engagements and work that your team is doing. So I see we've got some questions coming in, so feel free to keep throwing those in and we will dive into them now. Let me click over here. Let's see. Can advocates see all of the different letters when filling out a form? So advocates will be able to see the different groups of targets depending on who they are represented by, because they might be represented by different officials who fall into different ones of those buckets. For example, if you have one Republican senator and one Democratic senator, you would be able to see those different versions so that you are comfortable with what is being sent to your legislator. We don't want advocates feeling like they are sending a message that they aren't aware of what they're saying, because obviously they're putting their name on it. So they would be able to see those different variations when their folks fall into different buckets. Let's see here. Yes, repeat what I said about sending up to 50 different messages with AI. So Quorum introduced a series of AI features over the last couple of weeks, and one of those helps to optimize the messages in your grassroots campaigns. The first, most basic way that you can use that is if you're not using those targeted groups, you're just sending one version of a letter to any member of Congress. You can click a button that has AI generate up to 300 variations of that message, so that instead of a legislator receiving a couple hundred identical emails, they can receive ones that have the same core message, the same representation of your issue, but are different. So they're not getting identical copies of that email. When you use those smaller groups of up to 6 groups, like broken down by party or by region, like I showed, it can do up to 50 variations per group. So still with that same 300 number. So it is generated by AI based on your team crafting an original message. So you write the first one, you have full control over it. It will generate many variations. You can click through and see those variations before approving them, but does give you more variation in what the legislator receives to make that feel a little bit more personal as they go through that process. Are there tools to help with 990 reporting? So we don't have formal functionality for those reporting systems. What we do see some folks do is use Quorum's interaction loggers to log their meetings with lawmakers and their time spent in those meetings so that they have some track record of the amount of time that they were engaging on the Hill. And so that is one way that folks use a system like Quorum to benefit that process, but it is not a formal form submission process through our tools. The social media tracking of issue mentions, is that functionality Quorum provides? It absolutely is. So Quorum has a whole series of primary source documents that you can track from elected officials of the federal, state, local, international, EU levels of government, including Twitter, Facebook, press releases, newsletters to constituents, floor statements, statements and hearings with some variation depending on the level of government and how much is available on their websites. So there are a lot of ways to use this data. I think it's one of the most powerful parts of Quorum. So things like what you see here, identifying those key legislators that you maybe aren't paying as much attention to as you should, setting alerts so that if someone starts speaking out on your issue and you need to engage with them, you need to correct the record, you have the resources to do that. You can track trends in the volume on a given keyword or mention of your issue so that you can see what's maybe gaining more traction or what is kind of falling off the plate of the legislature in a given time period. So it's really, really powerful. I'll flag there are also some new AI features available there to make that process really easy for folks who maybe already have Quorum and are familiar with our search. So that includes things like a very common one is that there's so many different ways to talk about a given issue. And so what you can do is, let's say your topic is, I worked with someone the other day on facial recognition and mentions of facial recognition. Using our AI tools, we can generate all of the different ways that someone might talk about facial recognition, knowing that there's different language that's used. So it'll come up with all of those other ways that you could talk about it using smart AI functionality. Okay, let's see what we've got here. Can we do the same type of custom targeting for social media campaigns? I don't see a way to limit an advocate to only tweeting at their legislator. Blake, that's a great question. I am not 100% sure. And so I'm going to recommend reaching out to our support team to answer that. I don't want to give an incorrect answer here. So I would recommend reaching out to them and they can absolutely help you with that. For those who are joining, yes, we will be sharing the PowerPoint and the recording here for anyone who would like to dig into that. I see one question: what is the compatibility with PAC management? So Quorum does offer PAC tools and PAC services for folks who are managing federal PACs, and that does operate in the same system. And so something that can be helpful there with that kind of compatibility is if you are activating employees for PAC and advocacy efforts, you don't have to maintain two different databases. The same tools that you can use to send calls to action for the advocacy side through Quorum Outbox, our email tool, you can use to send to PAC members for soliciting contributions. The same profiles of officials, you can click in and see their legislative history, as well as their the contributions that you have given to those officials. So yes. And then finally, just kind of one of the biggest things is that usability. You don't have to learn two different systems. The interface is going to operate really similarly, whether you're working on advocacy work or PAC work or lobbying and all those things. So there is compatibility with PAC management. You can visit quorum.us/PAC to dig in more there. I think we've got all the questions answered so far. Does anyone else have any before we wrap today? So I'll give one last plug. In the chat, we have pinned a survey. It'll take 5 minutes. We're looking for just a few more responses before we close that at the end of today. And anyone who enters with their email address will be entered into a raffle for some really awesome prizes. So if you haven't, please take a moment. We would really appreciate it. And you will be hearing from us soon with our next series of webinars for the upcoming months. I would highly recommend checking out our Ask Me Anything series. We had a great session a week or so ago with some AI professionals on AI policy and what the policy landscape there will look like. And we've got some exciting sessions coming up that we will be emailing about soon. So please keep an eye out for those. And thank you again for joining.